Johnny Depp is not only a famous actor, but also a shrewd investor. For many years, he has invested in various fields, including the Golden Fork, a chain of upscale restaurants in which he is one of the largest shareholders. The restaurant once enjoyed an excellent reputation, renowned for its outstanding service quality and luxurious ambiance. But recently, something changed. Financial reports from Rick, the restaurant's manager, sent to Johnny paint a bleak picture. Sharply declining revenues, abnormally rising operating expenses, and dividends that are noticeably lower than in previous years. At first, Johnny assumed this might be due to the overall economic climate. However, upon closer examination of the figures, he began to notice unreasonable expenditures and discrepancies that didn't match reality. Rick offered a vague explanation, lacking any clear evidence. A sense of unease began to grow. Johnny knew something was not right. Instead of sitting in his office and continuing to rely on the paper reports, he decided to check the situation for himself. He wanted to witness firsthand the true state of the restaurant and experience what was really happening, and he knew exactly what to do. Saturday night, the busiest time of the week, was the best moment to assess the real situation at the Golden Fork. Johnny chose a branch far from the city center, a location where VIP guests rarely visited, and where he suspected the most serious problems lay. He dressed simply, dark-colored jacket, jeans, and loafers. No tailored suit, no aura of stardom. To avoid being recognized, he wore sunglasses and a baseball cap. The moment he stepped into the restaurant, something made him pause. The luxurious, warm atmosphere that once defined the place was gone. Instead, there was tension, a heavy, suffocating air. The welcoming smiles of the staff were absent, as was the professional service. Customers sat waiting with exhausted expressions. Some checked their watches repeatedly, others shook their heads, whispering to each other in frustration. Several tables remained uncleared, dirty dishes piled up, creating a chaotic sight. Johnny walked toward an empty table by the window, deliberately observing every detail. He missed nothing. A waitress approached slowly. Megan, according to the name tag on her uniform. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her face marked with exhaustion. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she had been working for hours without a break. She held a notepad in her hands, but her fingers trembled slightly. When she spoke, she tried to maintain professionalism, but her voice lacked energy. "Hello, sir. What would you like to order?" Johnny observed her silently. Her hands gripped the notepad tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Instead of ordering right away, Johnny spoke in a calm voice. "I'll order in a bit, but could I have a glass of water first?" Megan nodded and quickly walked away. But it took 10 minutes before Johnny finally got his glass of water. 10 minutes, just for a single glass of water. He frowned, the uneasy feeling growing stronger. How could a high-end restaurant have service this terrible? He continued to observe. In one corner of the room, a small family was still waiting for their food, even though they had arrived a long time ago. The father glanced around impatiently, while the young child began to fidget in their seat, clearly losing patience. Near the bar, a young couple was whispering to each other, clearly dissatisfied. One of them slowly placed the menu down and shook their head. A middle-aged man dressed neatly stood up and walked to the reception desk. His voice was sharp with frustration. "We've been waiting for over 40 minutes, and we still haven't received our main course. What kind of service is this?" The receptionist stammered an apology, but there was no confidence in her voice. Johnny had never seen the Golden Fork in such a state. Megan returned with a glass of water, setting it down in front of Johnny, but she avoided making eye contact. Johnny offered a small smile, trying to make her feel at ease. "Thank you. Looks like it's a busy day." Megan pressed her lips together, as if unsure whether she should answer. But after a brief hesitation, she spoke, her voice so soft that Johnny almost didn't hear her. "We're always short-staffed, not just today." A simple sentence, but Johnny understood a lot. No one had mentioned staff shortages, exhausted employees, or declining service quality in the reports he had received from Rick. But now he had seen it with his own eyes. This was not the restaurant he had invested in. Someone had turned it into this, and Johnny was going to find out the truth. Johnny sat in the corner, silently observing everything happening around him. When his food arrived, he took a small bite. The taste wasn't terrible, but it wasn't exceptional either. A dish that should have carried the refinement and richness of a high-end restaurant instead felt careless and uninspired. There was no trace left of the golden fork he once knew. At that moment, an elderly gentleman at the table next to him signaled for a server. He politely mentioned that his steak was overcooked, not how he had originally ordered it. Megan, the waitress Johnny had noticed earlier, lowered her head slightly, her eyes filled with unease. She quickly headed to the kitchen to report the issue. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man with a scowling face emerged from behind the cashier's counter. Rick, the restaurant manager, approached with an attitude that couldn't have been worse. No smile, no professionalism. He simply crossed his arms, stood in front of the elderly customer, and stated flatly that the dish had been prepared according to the correct recipe. If the customer was unhappy, he could order something else. No apology, no attempt to make things right. Johnny stared at Rick, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. This restaurant was once known for its hospitality, for treating customers like honored guests. But now the manager's attitude was closer to driving customers away rather than keeping them. The elderly man hesitated, clearly not expecting such a response. He remained silent for a moment before simply shaking his head, standing up, and leaving the restaurant. As the door closed behind him, a heavy tension filled the air. Other customers had witnessed the entire scene. Some whispered among themselves, while others quietly cast disapproving glances at Rick. Megan, who had just returned from the kitchen, stood still for a moment, lowering her head as if she had seen this happen far too many times before. Johnny kept watching. Behind the counter, Connor, a young kitchen staff member, clenched his fist slightly. He was clearly frustrated by Rick's behavior, but didn't dare to speak up. The atmosphere grew suffocating. Johnny realized the problem wasn't just an overcooked dish. This went far deeper. The restaurant didn't just have poor service. It had a toxic work environment. The staff was afraid. The management was indifferent. The customers were abandoned. If this continued, it would push the golden fork to ruin. Johnny tightened his fist. He couldn't sit still any longer. Not only were customers having terrible experiences, but even the employees were being pushed to their limits. Johnny kept watching, noticing the exhaustion clearly written on Megan's face. The young waitress, who had just been scolded by Rick earlier, was now carefully carrying a glass of orange juice to a table at the front. But halfway there, her hands trembled slightly. The glass slipped from the tray, crashed onto the floor, and shattered into pieces. For a second, every sound in the restaurant seemed to stop. All eyes turned toward the young woman. Panic flashed across her face as she immediately crouched down, reaching for the broken shards. But before she could do anything, Rick stormed over, his voice filled with frustration. Johnny didn't need to guess. He knew exactly what was going to happen next. And just as expected, Rick didn't care about helping his employee. He simply stood there, arms crossed, glaring at Megan as if she had committed an unforgivable crime. He didn't acknowledge that it was just a minor accident. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He only raised his voice, blaming her, humiliating her in front of all the customers. Megan lowered her head, not daring to respond. Her hands trembled as she picked up the broken glass, her breath shaky. No one defended her. The other staff members stood still, their eyes filled with helplessness. No one dared to speak up. Connor, the young kitchen staff member behind the counter, clenched his fist slightly. It was clear he had seen this happen many times before, but just like everyone else, he couldn't do anything. Because if Connor spoke up, he might be the next one to be yelled at tomorrow, or worse, he might lose his job. Johnny watched the scene unfold, feeling his anger rise. A restaurant cannot succeed if its employees work in constant fear. Employees cannot provide good service if they are always worried about being humiliated or fired over a small mistake. Johnny placed his coffee cup back on the table and took a deep breath. He understood the full picture now. The restaurant wasn't struggling because of the market. It wasn't because customers had become more demanding. It wasn't even because of high operating costs. The real reason was much simpler. This restaurant was destroying itself. A restaurant cannot survive if employees are overworked and treated unfairly, customers are neglected and disrespected, management rules with intimidation instead of understanding. All of this had turned the golden fork into something unrecognizable. It was all crystal clear now. Johnny knew it was time to act. Breaking the silence. Johnny stood up and slowly walked toward the cashier's counter. He was no longer just a quiet customer sitting in the background. He was Johnny Depp. He was the largest shareholder of this restaurant chain. Rick flinched as he saw Johnny approaching. He had no idea that the man standing before him was one of the most powerful figures in the Golden Fork. But in just a few minutes, he would know the truth. Johnny stood at the counter, his sharp gaze fixed on Rick. There was no need to speak, no need to issue commands right away, because in the tense silence of the restaurant, everyone could sense that something big was about to happen. Johnny Depp was done waiting. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked straight toward the front desk. The atmosphere inside the restaurant remained just as tense as when he first arrived. A few customers had already left, abandoning cluttered tables that remained uncleared. The staff moved hastily between sections, but there was no organization, no structure. They weren't serving guests. They were merely trying to survive. At the cashier's desk, a receptionist typed away on an outdated computer. Her face was tense, exhaustion evident in her eyes. When she noticed Johnny approaching, she forced a professional smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Johnny didn't waste time. His voice was calm but firm. He wanted to speak to the manager. The receptionist hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes flickering toward the wooden door behind the counter. She seemed to be debating whether or not to call him out, but in the end, she simply nodded and told Johnny to wait a moment. A few minutes later, Rick, the restaurant manager, stepped out of his office. He was a middle-aged man wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and a loosely knotted tie. There was nothing professional about his appearance. As he looked Johnny up and down, he raised an eyebrow, as if sizing up a troublesome customer. His tone was curt. He asked what the problem was. Johnny didn't respond right away. He removed his sunglasses and met Rick's gaze directly. His voice was steady, but razor sharp. He was Johnny Depp. He was the largest shareholder of this restaurant. The room seemed to freeze instantly. Everyone, from the employees to the customers, even the chefs in the kitchen, paused what they were doing. Some turned to stare at Johnny in shock. A few employees exchanged discreet, astonished glances. Rick stiffened. His brain seemed to struggle to process what he had just heard. He stammered, asking again as if he couldn't believe it. Johnny didn't frown. He didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there looking directly at Rick, making it clear that this was no joke. The silence in the restaurant was so thick that Johnny could hear the quickened breaths of a few employees. He didn't wait any longer. He announced that he wanted an immediate meeting and demanded to speak with the entire staff. And just like that, the silence shattered like a crashing wave. Some employees exchanged quiet, relieved smiles. For the first time in a long time, someone was standing up for them. But for Rick, this was far from good news. He could feel it now. The storm was coming. Rick's office was small and cramped, cluttered with scattered papers and an outdated computer. Everything in the room reflected a poorly managed system, lacking organization. Johnny sat down, his fingers interlaced on the desk. Across from him, Rick struggled to maintain a calm demeanor, but Johnny could see the sweat forming on his forehead. The employees began to step inside. Some were hesitant. Others carried a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Johnny let them speak freely. He wanted to understand what was really happening beyond the cold, lifeless financial reports. Megan, the waitress Johnny had noticed from the start, was the first to speak. She described 12-hour shifts with no breaks, wages so low they weren't enough to cover basic living expenses. She spoke of Rick's constant yelling, of being humiliated in front of customers. Another employee, Connor, the young kitchen staff member, stood up and explained how they were constantly running out of ingredients. But Rick never cared. When supplies ran low, the kitchen staff was forced to use old ingredients. Connor said this had severely impacted the quality of the food, leading customers to lose faith in the restaurant. But if they spoke up, they were threatened with losing their jobs. Johnny clenched his fists. He could feel the anger building inside his chest. A senior employee, someone who had been working there for over 3 years, spoke in a low, sorrowful voice. He said the team's morale had been completely destroyed ever since Rick took over. Everyone nodded in agreement. Some couldn't hold back their emotions. They lowered their heads, silently wiping away tears. Johnny sat in silence. He didn't need to hear any more. Everything was painfully clear. Revenue didn't decline because of demanding customers or a struggling market. Revenue declined because this restaurant was suffocating itself. An indifferent manager, a staff working in fear, an operational system riddled with carelessness. There was no way a business could survive in an environment like this. Johnny pressed both hands on the desk, his cold, piercing gaze locking onto Rick. Rick swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. Johnny didn't wait another second. He announced Rick's immediate termination. Rick shot up from his chair, about to protest. But when he met Johnny's unwavering stare, he knew the fight was already over. There was no chance to salvage the situation. He fell silent, lowering his head in resignation. Next, Johnny placed the head chef on a 30-day probation period to improve his attitude and the quality of the food. He ordered additional staff to be hired to reduce the workload and increased wages to boost morale. As Johnny declared his decisions, a few employees burst into tears of relief. Others exhaled deeply, as if a massive weight had finally been lifted off their shoulders. No one in the room spoke up to defend Rick. He had destroyed his own career. Finally, security entered and escorted Rick out of the office. The door closed behind him. The restaurant had officially entered a new chapter. After the tense meeting, Johnny didn't leave immediately. He knew that a decision like this only held meaning if it was enforced completely. With Rick gone, his responsibility now was to rebuild trust and reform the restaurant's entire system. Johnny decided he wouldn't just be a distant shareholder. He would be here, working alongside the staff, observing, guiding, and ensuring that every promise he made would come to life. The very next morning, Johnny returned to the restaurant. Without Rick, the atmosphere had already changed significantly. There were no more shouts, no more fearful glances, yet a quiet uncertainty still lingered. The staff couldn't quite believe that things had truly changed. Megan was the first to arrive. She still wore her old apron, but there was something different in her eyes. She no longer avoided Johnny's gaze. Instead, there was a hint of curiosity and cautious optimism. Connor was there too, standing in the kitchen, looking more focused than ever. He was still a bit tense, but the helplessness from before was gone. Johnny stepped inside, set his jacket aside, and walked straight to the front desk. There was no need for an announcement, no need for grand gestures. He was simply here to work. He began observing Megan, watching how she served customers. She was just as quick as before, but this time, there was no sense of pressure. When a customer walked in, she greeted them with a genuine smile, not a forced one. In the kitchen, Connor was guiding a new employee on how to properly organize ingredients. He was serious, but the most notable thing was how he listened patiently and explained, rather than criticizing. Johnny realized something. Employees didn't need someone barking orders at them. They needed someone willing to work alongside them, someone who could help them find better ways to do their jobs. He made his way into the kitchen, observing how things operated firsthand. The utensils were still unorganized, and the ingredients weren't yet arranged efficiently. But what caught Johnny's attention the most was Connor's growing sense of responsibility. There was no need to wait any longer. Johnny pulled up a chair and sat down beside Connor, going through the inventory list together. Connor was surprised to see Johnny not just standing by, but actively helping. He hesitated before asking if Johnny really needed to do this. Johnny simply replied, "If we want change, we have to start with the smallest things." That response made Connor smile. He nodded, and together they began reorganizing everything. Change had begun with small actions like these. In just 2 weeks, the difference was undeniable. The staff no longer worked in fear. The kitchen was no longer a place suffocated by invisible tension. Service speed had improved significantly, and most importantly, customers were starting to return. One of the biggest changes was how the employees worked together. Before, everyone only focused on their own tasks, paying no attention to others. But now they had started supporting one another. Whenever someone needed help, there was always someone ready to step in. Megan no longer worked with exhaustion in her eyes. She had become more proactive, suggesting improvements to the service process to increase efficiency while maintaining quality. She even took the initiative to train new employees, helping them adapt to the job more quickly. Connor, who had once been just a cook following orders, had now become a true leader in the kitchen. He no longer just focused on preparing food. He guided others, helping them work more efficiently. One day, Johnny walked into the restaurant and saw a scene that made him smile. In the corner of the room, a small family was enjoying their meal. A young child fidgeted playfully in their seat, but instead of looking annoyed, Megan gently handed them a sheet of drawing paper and some colored pencils. She crouched down, said something to the child, and made them giggle. In the kitchen, Connor was working with another staff member, experimenting with a new sauce recipe. He was no longer just a cook following orders. He was someone who took responsibility for the quality of the food. Johnny knew this was just the beginning, but the results were already clear. After 1 month, the restaurant's financial reports showed a remarkable shift. Revenue was rising again. Customer reviews were better than before. Former customers had started returning, bringing new friends along with them. But the most important thing wasn't the numbers. The most important thing was the people. Megan was no longer an exhausted waitress crushed under pressure. She had become a dedicated employee, someone who genuinely loved her job. Connor was no longer an overworked cook. He had become a voice that mattered, a leader who could guide his team. The restaurant wasn't just serving food anymore. It had become a place where employees felt valued, customers felt welcomed, and everyone had a reason to return. Johnny knew this was a valuable lesson. A business doesn't survive on profit alone. It survives through the people who work every day to build it. When they are drained, when they are treated like soulless machines, a business will slowly die. But when they are empowered, when they are treated fairly and given the opportunity to grow, they will make a business thrive like never before. Johnny stepped out of the restaurant, looking up at the sign that read, "The Golden Fork," with a quiet smile. From this moment on, this place would never go back to what it once was, and Johnny would make sure of that. As the changes began to take effect, Johnny took time to sit back and reflect, not just to review revenue or analyze numbers, but to look back on the journey he and his team had been through. Just weeks ago, the Golden Fork had been a dark place, where employees feared coming to work, customers left disappointed, and the business was rotting from the inside, driven by people who cared only about power, not compassion. Now the restaurant was no longer shrouded in gloom. Megan no longer worked in fear. She had become a dedicated employee, always greeting customers with a genuine smile. More than that, she took the initiative to suggest ways to improve service and make the restaurant run more efficiently. Connor, once an overworked kitchen staff member, had transformed into a true leader. He not only ensured the quality of the food, but also mentored new employees, helping them integrate more quickly into the workplace. But most importantly, the staff no longer felt oppressed. They were no longer just workers struggling to get through the day. They had rediscovered the joy in their jobs, the true meaning of service. Johnny understood that profit doesn't come from blindly cutting costs or overburdening employees. Profit comes from people. When employees are happy, customers can feel it. When employees are respected, they work with a greater sense of responsibility, creating better experiences for customers. And when customers are satisfied, they return. They bring their friends, and the business grows in the most sustainable way possible. Looking back at everything that had happened, Johnny realized one thing. A business cannot grow by relying solely on numbers in a report. A business thrives when it puts people first. Johnny didn't want this to be just a temporary change. He didn't want to fix only one branch of the Golden Fork while ignoring the others. So he set out to execute an even bolder plan. He arranged a meeting with the other shareholders of the restaurant chain, presented his findings, and proposed a complete system-wide reform. Not everyone agreed immediately. Some were concerned about the cost of increasing employee wages, while others doubted whether improving the work environment would truly boost revenue. But Johnny didn't need to convince them with theories. He showed them the latest numbers from the branch he had reformed. Revenue had grown. The number of returning customers had increased significantly. Online reviews had improved drastically. And most importantly, hiring costs had dropped. Because employees were no longer quitting in large numbers. The numbers were undeniable. In the end, the board of shareholders agreed. They decided to implement Johnny's model across the entire Golden Fork restaurant system. This wasn't just a victory in business, it was a victory for humanity. A few months later, when everything had settled, Johnny returned to the branch where it all began. This time, he walked in without needing to hide his identity. The staff greeted him with genuine smiles. No more tension, no more fear. Megan stood behind the reception desk, busy arranging reservations. She looked more confident, stronger than before. When she noticed Johnny, she nodded in acknowledgement, her eyes filled with gratitude. In the kitchen, Connor was guiding a new employee through the process of preparing a signature dish. There was no rush, no pressure, only passion for the craft of cooking. Denise, the new manager Johnny had hired, stepped out of the office, holding a stack of documents. She was an experienced leader with a clear vision of how to manage a team. Under her leadership, the restaurant was not just running smoothly, it was thriving. Johnny smiled. He knew he had done the right thing. From now on, he would never allow any branch of the Golden Fork to fall back into its former state, because he had learned a valuable lesson. A business thrives only when it treats well the very people who build it. Johnny left with a sense of relief. This time, he had no worries. The restaurant was back on track, and the people here had found themselves again. That was the true definition of success.